Good morning or afternoon or midday, or I don't actually think there's any other time of the day if I'm being honest. But hi everyone. You're probably noticing, if you're watching the visuals, you're probably noticing a bit of a different background to the normal background. I'm at home today. How fun. So, is honestly, if you guys want to know the real reason, it's because I was too cold to leave my house today. So I'm sitting here in my trackies and my jumper, snug as a bug in a rug. So yeah, that's all I really have to say. I'm in such a zen, in a zen mood. If you guys listen to my previous podcast, you would know how much I love a clean house and like a Sunday reset. I done a Friday reset today and my house just feels amazing. So I feel amazing and here we are. Okay, so I'm recording the Monday Madness episode on my couch, which I think is perfect. New series, new start, and it won't be a permanent new background, but we mix it up around here. You might see a little bit more of my home this season, just because I know you guys want to know a little bit more about me. I live with 3 men. So trying to navigate filming times in my house is very hard, hence why I just go and record elsewhere. It's just easier that way, and I find my creative juices are really flowing. Sometimes I'm giving myself the ick this episode. Anyway, enough jibber jabber. I'm going on and on. Yeah, we're nearly 5 minutes in and I've said nothing of any use to anyone. But there you go. That's a little bit more on me. Trying to navigate the house with men, recording times, all sorts of stuff. Back to why we're all really here, which is for the episode. So to basically give you guys a little bit of a rundown of what Monday Madness is, because I don't know if I've really gone through the game plan. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that I probably don't know the game plan. But I have a little bit more of an idea of the game plan now. So this is what I'm thinking. And of course, you guys can tell me if you like the idea, if you think it needs a razzle dazzle, if we should just scrap it and try something new. But essentially, this is what I've come up with. So 1 additional episode on a Monday every month. And I've titled it Monday Madness because it's just going to be truly chaotic cases. So it'll be a combination of cases. There's sort of like no banner. It might be about serial killers. It might be about a crazy disappearance, or I just don't really know. The possibilities are endless, and trying to think of them off the top of my head is making me nervous. But essentially, that's what I'm thinking. So today I'm bringing to you the first episode of the season. So for the first case of this season, I'm going to bring you one that has honestly sat on my mind since the moment I heard it. And I know that I say that about a lot of cases, but this case, it's so many things. It's so many factors and little pieces that are just combined, and it makes me ill. I have a lot of trouble with this case, but I also feel like it's actually one I sat on as to like, do I want to share? Because even when I first heard it, and I listen to a lot of true crime, so sometimes things don't, like, people are just nuts. And when you read a lot of true crime, you kind of figure out that the human race, all of us, are pretty nuts. Some obviously more so than others. But this one just really, really sat with me. Like, I hear a lot of cases and then sometimes I forget about them and then I hear about them again and I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that one. But this one, it's never gotten out of my mind. And maybe that's got to do with some of the visuals that come with this case, which I will be showing throughout. And there are some on our Instagram reels and our TikTok reels, but of course I've kind of tried to keep that a little bit more seasoned. TikTok has a little bit more than Instagram if you guys ever want a little bit more nitty gritty. Our TikTok, I kind of put a little bit more on there, which it's hard to tell which platform kind of allows it. I feel like I haven't had too much trouble yet. I've had a little bit here and there, but obviously I want you guys to see the visuals, and I generally always tag it in the episode notes. So if you guys do want to see some of the things that I mentioned throughout and I don't say it, it will probably be linked below. If it's not, hit me up and I will get you guys the info you need. Otherwise, it's pretty easy accessible online everywhere. Reddit and Twitter, now renamed as X, generally has a lot of that stuff. I don't really want to push people to go on X because you see, in my opinion, like it's obviously great, but you also see a lot of absurd stuff on there. There's no censoring. Okay, so before I get started, I do want to put a trigger warning on today's case. We are talking about kids, and I feel like I don't actually verbally say this enough. I generally put it in just the episode notes, but I want to put a trigger warning. We're talking about kids. We're talking about a child. We are talking about the death of children. And if you feel like that is going to trigger you, I will catch you in the next episode. Please don't ever put yourself in a position where you feel like it's going to mentally harm you to listen to this. Like I said, this one really does sit with me. But it's also, I feel like, very important to shed light on even the harder cases that are to bring to a platform and try to bring them in a way that is for my short attention span people, and also in an informative manner where I've tried to get the information as correct as possible. Again, like I always say in every episode, if I have missed anything or I haven't expanded on something or I've gotten information wrong, please let me know. We're all learning. It's always a learning curve here. And like I said, I try to do as much information as possible. I have found, and I don't know if anyone else has found this, some stuff I have to go on my American VPN to actually be able to access some info from Australia, which is nuts to me. But anyway, we're going to get into today's case. That's what I've got to say. Please bear all that in mind and let's get into it. So for Monday Madness episode 1, we're going to be diving into the story and the case of Dylan Redwine, a 13-year-old boy from Colorado who vanished during a court-ordered visit with his estranged father. Now, I want to sort of say that a lot of platforms did say estranged. He wasn't really estranged from his dad necessarily, but Dylan didn't like staying with his dad. And we'll get into that a lot more throughout the story. But I just want to emphasize that I don't necessarily agree with that, but that is what a lot of the headlines say. And unfortunately, Dylan's tragic fate does take years to uncover, but we do get answers. So unfortunately, this is a story about a young life that was stolen, about failures of a justice system that forced a child into a dangerous situation, about a family's heartbreak, and about a fight that is never truly over. So we will try to cover it all today. We're going to talk about Dylan's background, the timeline of his disappearance, the investigation, the discoveries, and the shocking evidence that led to an arrest. So like I say, in every single episode, buckle up, because this one is probably going to get you fired up and it might make you physically ill. As always, we're going to start with the most important part of the story, and that's Dylan. Because like I say in every episode, he is not just a headline and he's not just a name in all of these newspaper articles. He was a young boy. He was 13 years old and he had a full life ahead of him. So Dylan Redwine was born in 2000 and he was born in Colorado, and that would have made him 25 years old this year. And by all accounts, he was a fun, smart, and active kid. He loved sports and he especially loved baseball. He was known for being friendly and easygoing. Friends and family described him as having a bright personality and a great sense of humor. But I want to be clear on one fact, is that Dylan's home life wasn't necessarily easy. So Dylan's parents, Mark and Elaine Redwine, had a very bitter divorce. And it was one that was filled with allegations of abuse. It had custody battles and years of tension. So by 2012, Dylan was living full time with his mum Elaine in Colorado Springs, and this was roughly 300 miles away from his father Mark, who was living in the small town of Vallecino or Vallecino. I'm going to go Vallecino. That's what I'm going to stick with, Vallecino. I feel like my Aussie accent really starts to come out when I try to say some of these US suburbs and states and stuff. So it's important to note that throughout this period, Dylan was reportedly saying that he did not want to visit his father. He had told friends and family that he felt uncomfortable and unsafe around Mark. Now, at the time that Dylan was saying all of these things, the custody battle and the divorce proceedings were still ongoing. And at the time of Dylan's disappearance, all of this was still ongoing. So they were still in court trying to figure out a custody arrangement, trying to finalize the divorce. So it's important to note that there was no rock solid, I guess, this is how it's going to be until Dylan turns 18, unless, of course, somebody had filed for something in between, but they hadn't made any official call. So due to that, Elaine had primary custody, but unfortunately, because the battles were ongoing, Mark still had visitation rights to Dylan. And this was despite Dylan saying that he didn't want to be a part of his dad's life. So at that point, it was the court's choice and not Dylan's and not Elaine's. Because of this court order, Dylan was forced to spend Thanksgiving 2012 at his father's house in Vallecino. And shortly after arriving on this visit with Mark in Thanksgiving of 2012, Dylan was never seen again. Okay, so now we're going to jump ahead a little bit and get to the day that Dylan disappeared, because there's a lot to break down in this case. So I'm trying to get through these bits relatively quickly so that you guys can kind of gather an idea of what happened. Now I want you guys to really try follow this timeline because it matters. The things that were reported, the CCTV, everything I'm about to state, it all matters and a lot of it comes back. So just bear with me. Okay, so this all starts on November 18th of 2012. Dylan arrives at the Durango La Plata County Airport. I think that's how you say it. And he was, of course, flown in for the court-ordered visit. So the CCTV footage actually shows Dylan's arrival, which is at the exact time of 5:52 p.m. Mark then picks him up from the airport. They stop at Walmart where CCTV footage shows the two shopping. And later they stop at a fast food restaurant. Then we fast forward to the evening, which we're getting pretty close to anyway, gathered Dylan's arrival was 5:52. So the evening of November 18th, Mark claims they went home, watched TV, and went to bed. Dylan texted his friend around 9:30 p.m. making plans to meet the next morning. So I'm going to express my opinion here and say that I feel as though Dylan's friend knew that Dylan wasn't very pleased to be spending Thanksgiving with his father. I think Dylan had made it quite clear to his friend that he didn't really want to be a part of his dad's life at this point. So a series of text messages were sent to Dylan from his friend the next day that seemed to be expressing concern when Dylan didn't arrive to their meet. So some of the things that were sent in these text messages were, "Come to Nando's, dude, your dad's out looking for you. Are you all right, dude? You need to call someone ASAP. We are worried about you. Your mum called and she's so worried, bro. Seriously, you need to message someone." So we're going to move on to the day after the 18th, which is obviously the 19th. And this is the reported day that Dylan vanishes. The first full day. So I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a breakdown of November 19th, 2012. So Mark claims he left the house in the morning to run errands, and he said he left at around 7:30. He claims he had asked Dylan if he wanted to come, and Dylan had said no. So Mark then left, and when he returned, Dylan was gone. He stated a fishing pole was missing along with Dylan's phone and Dylan's backpack. He even claimed that Nickelodeon was still playing on the TV. The front door was apparently left wide open. Now I really want to note that Mark was not concerned, didn't seem concerned, was not concerned about this at all. He actually waited until a few more hours had passed before he started to get a little bit more concerned. So I want to back it up, and this is what we know. Dylan missed his planned meet with his friends, which is something that was very unlike him. His dad returned home to find no Dylan, the door reportedly left wide open, and a fishing pole missing. So by the evening, Mark started to get a bit concerned, which should have been done hours before this. But let's not get into my opinion too much. And I don't have an exact time on evening. I just know it was evening. Mark actually called Dylan's mum Elaine, and he used these words exactly. He claimed he had lost their son. It was very, very clear that he used that word because Elaine mentioned it many times throughout, that these are the words he used. So Elaine at this point was understandably worried and reported him missing. So this is where the case truly begins. And one thing I think is very important to note, because we didn't really get into it, but Mark's house is literally in the middle of nowhere. He was surrounded by woods for kilometers. Just woods, just a house and loads of woods. There were absolutely no neighbors nearby. So I know you probably don't like where this is going, but just get ready. So normally I come into the case and I talk about how the police don't jump into action quick enough and this and that, but I'm actually here to say that they did. They got into action pretty quickly on this one. However, they did only put him down as a potential missing person and not he's definitely missing. And I think this was due to Dylan's history and his background of not wanting to stay with his father. So I think they were sort of thinking maybe he ran away. My point that I always go back to is no young child can run away and stay away for this long with no plan in place. And if this really has, if this has happened, I feel like it's truly the 1%. So a massive search effort kicked off immediately. It was police, search and rescue teams, and volunteers that scoured the rugged San Juan mountains surrounding Vallecino. Dogs, helicopters, and drones were used throughout the search. Nearby lakes, cabins, and trails were searched. And this is when I sort of wish I could come to you with more, but this search brought up nothing. There was no signs of Dylan. His phone, his wallet, and his backpack were missing, but no trace was found. The police were able to track Dylan's phone, and they found that his cell phone stopped pinging at a location shortly after morning of November 19th. So now we're kind of going to get into the fact that from the beginning of this case, something felt off. And I don't know if that is for everybody or just for Elaine, because I don't know what the outroar at the time of this case was, whether the investigators were thinking the same thing, but I know for Elaine, something felt off from the jump. And here are some things that I want to note before we go any further. Mark's story that he gave the investigators was inconsistent. So the story that Mark gave the police is the exact same breakdown that I gave ahead before. That is what Mark had told the police, and that was inconsistent. Now we'll get into why it was inconsistent in a second, but that was the first thing. He was also uncooperative with all the search efforts. He refused to take a polygraph test, and he began making public statements that many found suspicious. Now I am going to play some clips of Mark throughout so that you can hear some of the things that he was saying at the time of this investigation before anything came to light.
Flight was late arriving. There was some delay leaving Denver. And so he didn't actually land probably, I want to say about 6 o'clock, 6:20, something like that. I don't remember exactly what time it was. But immediately leaving the airport, we went to Walmart.
Why'd you go to Walmart?
Well, I had just recently come in from doing a job in Silver City, New Mexico. So, I didn't have a whole lot of things for us to eat. And, Dylan's always adamant about having his snacks around and things for him to snack on when he's around. And So there was a need for us to go grab enough things from Walmart to be able to sustain ourselves for a day or two while we were figuring out. You know, I didn't even buy anything for Thanksgiving because I didn't have any concrete plan as to what we were going to do, whether we were going to do it here or whether we were going to do it somewhere else. So all I was trying to do is focus on, you know, having enough to get us by for the next couple of days till we could make those arrangements. You know, Dylan wanted to throw in a few videos that he found in the $5 bin, so we threw those in, which is one of the movies we would watch the night, you know, we were together.
So Mark's story about the fishing pole in particular didn't make any sense to Elaine, who's Dylan's mum. She knew her son and she knew that Dylan fucking hated fishing. Like, I'm going to say that the most Aussie way possible. He did not like to fish. This story felt completely off to her. Another important thing to note is Dylan's phone. Even though it was supposedly taken, having had no activity on it felt really off to Elaine because Dylan was your typical 13-year-old and he was incredibly active on his phone. And in 2012, I think phones, of course, different to what they are now, still similar. Like kids in 2012 were using their phones all the time. This felt off to her. Why had his phone not been used if he had taken it on the 19th? Why did it stop pinging morning of the 19th? So to break down the phone pinging, I want to note that his phone stopped pinging at a location on the 19th. However, there was actually no activity on his phone, such as text, social media, nothing, since the 18th of November, which, if we're going back, November 18th is the day that Dylan arrived to the court order visit with his dad. It's the day he was seen on CCTV footage with his dad at the airport, at Walmart, at a fast food restaurant. Everything stated after that was not captured. So everything that was stated after they were caught on CCTV footage, which I believe was the fast food restaurant, is all Mark's claims. So Elaine really did feel that Mark had something to do with Dylan's disappearance. And I know that sounds super sinister because Mark is Dylan's dad. But Elaine felt that. And I want to note that, of course, she had her suspicions about Mark, but she did state so many times throughout interviews that she wanted to remain hopeful despite her suspicions. She wanted to believe that Dylan was okay. So remember how back at the start I said that Dylan feared for his safety with Mark? Elaine feared for Dylan's safety just as much. So we also know that Dylan had told his mum and others that he didn't want to go to stay with his dad and that he didn't feel safe staying with his dad. It's important to also note that one of the text messages that Dylan sent to his friend the night before said something along the lines of, "I'd rather stay anywhere but my dad's house." Elaine did publicly accuse Mark of being involved in Dylan's disappearance. And while the police couldn't actually arrest Mark with no evidence, it is noted that they had serious doubts about Mark's version of events from the very beginning. I do want to note the one thing that Mark did do was he publicly pleaded for answers during the search of Dylan. So the next audio recording that I'm going to play is Mark himself talking about Dylan's disappearance.
So your son has been missing for 3 months, and his mother and father have not talked.
Dr. Phil, I'd like to make a comment. I personally have a lot of suspicions that Elaine could be involved in this, but I don't have anything to back that up, and I don't have anything to support that.
Do you honestly believe that she and a team abducted him? I was trained as a forensic psychologist, and I'm curious whether you're interested in fighting with her or if you're interested in finding your son. Because since you've been out here, you haven't said one word about your son.
Okay, now that you guys have heard that, let's lay out what we know after all of that. I'm going to start with some of Mark's suspicious behaviors. Claiming Dylan may have run away, despite absolutely no evidence of that. Refusing to let searchers look in certain parts of his property. And then getting on media appearances and appearing odd, making strange remarks. And then when Mark finally did do a polygraph, because remember I mentioned that he refused to do one, well, he finally did do one and he failed it. So I am going to touch on Mark's very odd behavior throughout his Dr. Phil appearances as well. Dr. Phil actually covered this case twice, but I'm not going to get too far ahead of ourselves because I do want to go back to the case for a second and what was going on within the case. The case status actually didn't change for months and months and months. And I feel like over the course of those months, some of the hope really did fade for the family that were wanting answers for what happened to Dylan. So fast forwarding, it's been about 7 months since Dylan's disappearance. It's June of 2013. And unfortunately, some of Dylan's remains were found about 8 miles from Mark's house. So 8 miles is 12.8 Ks, 12.9 Ks from Mark's. And they were located within a remote area in the mountains. So searchers located bones, a sock, and parts of his clothing. So this was absolutely heartbreaking for Elaine, I can just imagine, because it would have kind of taken the hope of Dylan coming home, but unfortunately it didn't give her full answers. And I wish I could tell you guys something better, but years passed and the case just dragged on and on. But I want to note that the police did keep investigating. It was just years before anything came to light officially. So then in 2015, which was years after Dylan's disappearance in 2012, even more of his remains were found. And this did include parts of his skull. Now, the remains showed that the injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma. So while the case did drag on for years and years, by 2015 and by the time that Dylan's skull was found, or part of Dylan's skull was found, and they were able to figure out that it was consistent with blunt force trauma, they were unfortunately able to gather the information that Dylan had been murdered. So the only light to this case is that I did mention in the beginning that there was an arrest. And I'm sure you're probably wondering what bit of evidence finally led to this arrest. Now, I need to go backwards again. So bear with me. I'm sorry. I really am. But I need to go back to when Dylan was alive and what Dylan found prior to Dylan's visit in Thanksgiving of 2012. Because it came to light that prior to that visit, him and his brother found some pretty horrific and graphic images of their dad. Now, they found these while they were on vacation. There are a couple of stories on how the kids actually managed to find these images, but I want to note I don't think any of us are exactly sure. I think the brother has definitely said some things. I'm going to play some clips where you can hear the brother speak. I'm not going to mention his name myself, but you will be able to find his name quite easily if you want to. I just feel like leaving him out of this episode for the obvious reasons that lay ahead. So it said that Mark had actually fallen asleep and Dylan had gone to use his computer. And during that time, he discovered the following images and videos of Mark, their father, on the laptop. These images included Mark eating feces out of a diaper, wearing women's lingerie, wearing a diaper himself, and smearing the feces. These images have surfaced online. So like I mentioned back in the beginning, you can find them on all of those uncensored platforms. And I have included them throughout our visuals on YouTube, and I have included some, probably the less graphic of them, if there is even any that you guys can consider that. In my eyes, probably the less graphic of them, on our Instagram and TikTok. Proceed with caution on that one because it is graphic and it is truly fucked up. So it all becomes really understandable as to why Dylan, a 13-year-old boy, didn't want to visit his father. When you're 13, you're so vulnerable. And I feel as though adults are confused by this behavior, let alone a child who's trying to understand their father. So Dylan did actually plan to confront his father about these images. He had even taken a photo of the images on his phone in an attempt to have enough evidence when he confronted his dad. So I'm going to insert a clip and audio for all my listeners out there so that you can get an idea of how deep this really goes.
didn't really look up to Mark. They had a relationship, but it was never what Dylan had wanted. It was always what Mark had wanted.
You're being very disrespectful, and I believe that everything that's coming out of your mouth is perpetuated by
I have my own mouth. I can say
Then
my
use
own
it.
words.
Then use it.
I am at you. I don't like you. I hate you, and you have been nothing of a father.
You say he has clear motivation. What do you mean? Are the photos genuine?
No, they are not.
Dylan's sitting on the bed, and he's like, Corey, look at these pictures. And it horrified me and Dylan.
The images that I have seen have been photoshopped. No, it's not me in the photos. Absolutely not.
Okay, so now I'm going to break everything down that we know currently so that we're not getting too lost before we go too much further ahead. This is the timeline that we know. So we know that Mark's story is beginning to not hold up. And now the police have phone records that show his movements aren't matching his claims. The location of Dylan's remains strongly suggested that someone was familiar with the area when they placed them there. And then we have the motive, which we now know is the discovery of those graphic images of Mark. And I don't think Mark wanted these images exposed. I sometimes think when we're at lengths of being exposed of things, our deepest and darkest secrets can sometimes drive us to the point of crazy. So going back to where I said Dylan was going to confront his dad about these images, I believe that he did actually confront him, because there was reportedly text messages where he was taunting him in these text messages, and whether I'm pretty sure it was Dylan taunting his dad over the images. So this drove police to believe that humiliation may have triggered Mark to kill Dylan. And then we go to, of course, Mark's behavior. So Mark's behavior after Dylan's disappearance was consistently invasive and suspicious. He refused to cooperate fully with the police, he failed polygraphs, and he blamed Elaine despite zero evidence, which I feel when you're guilty, sometimes you start pointing the finger, right? Okay, so remember how I mentioned before that Dr. Phil picked up this story? I want you guys to listen to some of these clips.
Or, done something and disposed. I strongly think that he's involved.
Why?
He hasn't done a single thing since Dylan has been gone.
Why do you say that? What has he not done?
He hasn't been to any of the benefits. He wasn't there for Dylan's birthday vigil. He hasn't helped at all with the Find Missing Dylan Redwine Fund.
And that's offensive to you.
Very.
Dr. Phil, I'd like to make a comment about the fundraiser thing. I have several people in the community in which I live that are reaching out to me on a daily basis and volunteering their time to have some involvement with a fundraiser. But somebody from this side of the room called her and told her that they didn't want her to have any involvement in anything that had anything to do with raising money, and didn't want me involved in any of that.
You're wrong, and you know you're wrong. If you want to raise money for Dylan's fund.
So just to make it completely crystal clear on the timeline of this episode as well, this aired a few months after Dylan's disappearance. So prior to the remains being found, prior to any of this other stuff coming to light. And it's actually reported that the reason Mark agreed to go on this show was to prove his innocence to his family and the public, and honestly, probably even the police department at this point. So I watched this Dr. Phil episode prior to any of this other stuff coming to light, essentially. And I remember feeling like Mark seemed off, like he had answers. Like I certainly feel like he had some answers, like he knew some things, and he was very invasive. The brother was very passionate about his hatred towards his dad and towards his allegations of believing his dad had something to do with it. Elaine just seems so desperate for anything, something, a grain of hope. And I remember watching it and thinking, this is devastating. And it's hard with shows like Dr. Phil to know how real this really is, if that makes sense. But I feel like in that episode, it was quite easy to tell that this was real heartbreak. So Mark, during this interview with Dr. Phil, denied a polygraph test. And we all know that polygraphs aren't accurate. They're very, very, very rarely admissible. But with all of this information, I would want to get a polygraph to clear my name. I feel like denying it made him look more guilty. And we know that at some point Mark did end up taking a polygraph. I actually read he took two, at least two, and both of those polygraphs resulted in fails. So it's not a wonder that he actually refused Dr. Phil at the time. Okay, so now I want to go back to our remains discovery, because those remains that were found in 2015, which included part of Dylan's skull, were found about 2Ks. I might be off on that. I believe they were about 2Ks from Mark's house. But they were, either way, they were enough of a radius to trigger the police to want to search Mark's house further. So during the search of Mark's house, the police actually were able to locate some things, which brought an awful end of a fight to answers. So once these remains were discovered, it was clear that he had been dismembered. However, his head was still missing. So parts of his skull was found, but parts of his head were still missing. And upon searching Mark's house, they found traces of Dylan's blood throughout the living room. So cadaver dogs and bloodhounds were brought in. Sensors were picked up for human remains, possibly inside Mark's washing machine, truck, and the blood traces and scents on the clothing he was wearing the night Dylan was last seen alive. So I don't know if you guys are wondering, but you might be. You might be wondering where Mark is, because I know when I was reading this, I'm going, where the fuck is Mark? Someone call Mark. It appears that Mark actually disappeared or ran either sometime after the remains being found and the investigation closing. So he was truly no help to this investigation whatsoever. Now, another strange note I'm going to put in there is that one of Mark's ex-wives said that Mark made a comment along the lines of, if I ever need to get rid of a body, I'm going to dispose of it in the mountains. Bit of a strange comment to make. Now, I also do want to specify that the police are still searching for the rest of Dylan's skull so that they can correctly identify what actually happened to Dylan. They can see, or they can gather a picture that it was blunt force trauma, but they can't solidify that it was at this point. So again, even after all that they have discovered and all of their suspicions, the case does go cold again. Mark isn't arrested, and the remaining critical parts of Dylan's skull have still not been located. Until almost 2 years to the exact date, the remaining part of Dylan's skull was finally found. Now, these were found 2 miles from the location of the previous remains that were found, so that's about 3.2 Ks. And unfortunately, these were actually located by a couple of hikers that actually just managed to stumble across it. And I'm scratching my head thinking, can you imagine? Can you imagine just stumbling across that? But also, how amazing that they were able to help finally bring this case to a close. So with all of this in hand, the authorities were finally able to find out what happened to Dylan. And it was determined after the autopsy and further investigation was conducted that Dylan died on the 18th of November in the evening. And this was the day that Dylan arrived for his court-ordered visit. Now, he died from blunt force trauma to the skull, causing severe fractures and sharp force injuries to his head and body, meaning he was struck by something sharp and blunt, heavy enough to cause a skull fracture and other further damage. So finally, after 5 years of investigations, the police believed they had enough. In July of 2017, Mark Redwine, Dylan's dad, was arrested for second-degree murder and child abuse resulting in death. So Mark Redwine's trial was delayed multiple times, in which I believe I don't think he was out on bail. I think he sat in jail. And I think this was also partly because of coronavirus at the time. But by June of 2021, the trial had finally begun. Now, I don't normally go into trials too much, but I am going to put a little bit of Mark's trial in this because I feel like it is quite interesting. And I am going to insert some audio clips and some clips so that you guys can see. But some of the key points from the trial are the following. Prosecutors argued that Mark murdered Dylan during the visit and then tried to hide the body. And the motive was the confrontation about the photos combined with Mark's violent tendencies. And then they got forensic experts to testify that Dylan's skull injuries were not consistent with an accident, but with homicidal violence. And there were so many witnesses that described Mark as controlling, violent, and unstable. So the prosecution's full story is that Mark killed Dylan after being confronted about the photos, in which Mark then, in a fit of rage or fear of being exposed, killed and dismembered his son's body and scattered them throughout the woods around his house. Mark's defense then tried to argue that Dylan ran away and was attacked by animals. But the evidence did tell a completely different story, so this didn't really hold up. Now, I'm actually going to insert some clips from the trial so that you guys can see and hear.
We are live in Colorado.
I said, Dylan, please be safe. Mom is here to come get you, son.
2021, 9 years after Dylan's disappearance and murder, Mark Redwine was found guilty. And he was found guilty of second-degree murder and child abuse resulting in death. He was sentenced to 48 years in prison.
Oh, I have to hope for Dylan. I mean, I'm his mom.
The search for missing Colorado teen Dylan Redwine has come to an end, and it's not the end anyone was hoping for.
Oh, just sadness. Just, how could you do this to him?
So I know we talk a lot about justice throughout these episodes, and it wasn't necessarily justice in the purest sense because nothing will ever bring Dylan back. But there was some form of justice in the fact that Mark did get somewhat of what he deserved. And for Dylan's family, it was about accountability. It meant that they finally had some answers. The worst part in this is when I say Dylan's family, Mark was Dylan's family, and he was the reason for all the pain and all the injustice. He was the one who withheld the truth and the answers from the people who were seeking Dylan, who loved Dylan, who wanted Dylan safe. So Mark done all this and then put his family through fucking hell for 9 years. But at least we finally saw some justice. So let's talk about where we are now, because I always like to bring this into my episodes no matter what, even if the case is closed, because there is still a level of this case that will never be finished. Dylan's mum, Elaine, has continued to speak publicly about the case. She advocates for better protections in family court. And one huge win out of all of this is that Dylan's story has become a powerful example of why children's voices should be heard, especially in custody battles. And as for Mark Redwine, he is in prison and he is still maintaining his innocence. He has never showed any form of remorse or care in regard to his son or this case. So some of the unanswered questions is, could this tragedy have been prevented? And I think yes, which goes back to why it's important that Dylan's story is used as a powerful tool into why children should have a say. Why did the court system force Dylan to visit his father, who he clearly feared and had every right to fear? Were there any earlier warning signs that were missed? Which leads me to my last one is, could others have known and failed to act? So what really haunts me is that Dylan didn't want to go. He told his friends, he told his mum, and no one listened. And I know that no one listened because they couldn't do anything, because the courts made this happen. And that's why I think it's so powerful that we are now able to at least turn this into something positive in preventing it for others. We couldn't do it for Dylan, but maybe we can do it for someone else. I think we, the public, the system, the justice system, owe it to Dylan and every other child that is in this position to do better. So I have brought you a truly mad, chaotic case, but it is truly tragic beyond words. And that's why I feel like it was the perfect starting episode for our Monday Madness. Because a boy lost his life A brother lost his brother, a mother lost her son, and a system failed to protect the person it should have protected the most. So that's why I go back to, you should tell people about this case and say Dylan's name, like I say in every case, is don't forget our victim's name. If a child tells you that they are afraid, please listen. So that is all for today's episode of Chaotic Crime, our new Monday Madness series. I really hope you guys enjoyed this. I really enjoyed being here and sharing this one with you, despite how hard and sickening it all was. If you guys have any thoughts or any theories, or you just need to vent about this one, you know where to find me. Please remember to follow us on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube. And thank you to all of my listeners. I also just want to make a special note to say thank you, because we just hit 15,000 downloads. I'm blown away. Thank you so much for being here with me, and for hearing me talk shit. So to finish it on the note that I always love to finish it on is stay loud, stay curious, and never stop asking questions.